Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode, The Pen is Mightier Than the Sword, with journalist Megan Kimble.
The Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
All right, let's get a roll call. Commissioner Kostelik.
Howdy, I am here.
You are here. Commissioner Smith.
I'm here. For a minute there, I didn't know if we were going to get Commissioner Costello.
I wasn't either. It was dicey, but he's with us, as am I. All right. Our agenda today includes our discussion item, our whiskey pairing, our interview with Megan Kimble, and our lightning round. Commissioners, can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Great. Okay. So just a reminder to all of our listeners, viewers, hit up our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Go to our YouTube page, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, and Deezer. Do us a favor, subscribe, like, give us feedback. Certainly you can email us as well. We always love that. In fact, we got a recommendation just yesterday on a future topic. Wheels are already turning, man. I think we're going to get into that and excited for it at a future date. So let's get into our discussion item of the day. How can planning-related environmental laws, how have they helped or hurt our communities? So, man, for a better part of 50 plus years now, right? We've had some attempts at environmental laws, mostly born out of the 60s, but you can argue even some going back further than that. But they've had good intentions. Have those intentions been met? Or do they block good things from happening? I'm curious. What do you all think? Don, you look at your puzzle. You got a look on your face of a good answer here.
I mean, I don't want to harp on the transportation side of things too much, but to me, the entire National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA process that state DOTs go through is a farce. It's clearly grooved for the desired outcome. I don't think they take alternatives seriously. And I recall being on one in North Carolina where they did recognize, because it was essentially doubling down on redlining. It was taking a red line highway, and the North Carolina DOT was expanding it. And their mitigation for the impacts it was having on a Black neighborhood was more public involvement, which I just cynically said, oh, we're going to give you more opportunities to hear exactly what we plan to do to your neighborhood. And there's nothing about it that, short of a lawsuit, really takes into account public feedback, public input to get at any of that. So that's the one on that side. I think the other one is just, and especially in a state like California that is so rigorous with that, it's really giving some fodder to the NIMBYs and others to oppose basic things like sidewalks and bike lanes, because they want to put it through this massive environmental process, really as a stall tactic.
Well, and I'll jump on that real quick before getting over to Jess, only because of what you just said. And that was, I hate to poke the finger in the eye of California, but non-transportation, it was a land use discussion that just happened recently. And I think it was in Berkeley or in the Stanford area, one or the other. But
it was Berkeley,
so it was an attempt at building, I think it was some sort of student housing type of project for the university, and it got denied, right? Based on the state environmental laws. And so folks used it in that way to prohibit, dense, more accessible housing in a place where, in that general vicinity where zoning was born, one of the places where zoning was born years and years ago. We've talked about that with other guests in the past. And so weaponizing it in a way, in this case, I'll use that term, man, and that sucks, because the well-intended consequences and the meaningful things that you're trying to actually use it for a good purpose of analysis and so forth for a good decision. In this case, lawyers got a hold of it maybe, and, turned it on its head and maybe did something that some people at least would argue shouldn't be done. So Jess, thoughts on that?
Well, not on that. I mean, I'm going to go a different direction.
Sure.
So, with a lot of with our guests thinking about affordable housing and some things like that, I'm going to think about the human environment and where planning was actually really helpful and some policies that we put in place. And I'm thinking about way back when in 1867 and then 79 and then 1901, the New York City tenement housing laws, those acts, and for our listeners that don't know and have not heard of these are kind of foundational laws that happened back in New York City, where it put standards in place for room size, ventilation, lighting, so that windows in housing units in New York City had fresh air and ventilation. And this was important for things like, people not getting sick and staying sick in their buildings and things. So I was thinking about that. I know that when we think environmental, we think a lot about, how development impacts the natural environment, or something we might call green infrastructure. But there's also this whole human environment, right? And where we live, and we live a lot in these in built environments, and what happens inside, and that fresh air and those windows we have, and even having indoor bathrooms, right? That all of that was not, you didn't have to do that. Talk about slumlords, right? Like back in the day, it wasn't even mandatory. And so of course those things have happened over time in the last 130, 140 years. So that's kind of what I thought of. I thought of human environment and what has planning done to change that, and those old tenement laws. And that's kind of thinking back to that planning educate, like a kind of a formal planning education, and those first things you learn about. And I remember thinking, whoa, that was something we had to deal with.
I was just going to say, the way that you were able to pull those years out, you're not even studying for AICP or anything. Like, wow.
I have this, I remember weird stuff. Now, listen, I can't remember things like, whether or not the Saints are football or baseball, but I can remember other things.
Yeah, well,
important stuff.
It's all good. That's all good. All right. Well, good discussion. So, Commissioner Kostelik, what do we got? Whiskey pairing. Let's turn our attention to the pen is mightier than the sword.
Well, the whiskey pairing, I went, since our guest today is housed down in Texas, I went with something with a Texas tie. Wild Turkey Long Branch. And if you don't know,
come on.
behind this, it's a combination of things. We've talked about the Tennessee mellowing process, where you essentially put the distilled spirit through the charcoal filtering to mellow it out. So that's essentially what they did with this Wild Turkey, except they used Texas mesquite instead of the sweet maple, I think is what's used in the Tennessee process. It was for a while, and it still is, a collaboration with Matthew McConaughey. So I'm sure that elicits some opinions on that as well. But
all right.
That's right.
Something like that. Something that I won't go.
I will tell you that for me is probably in my top 5 right now. I love Long Branch. It is, I think it really is a fantastic whiskey, regardless of who's trying to sell it to you. It definitely.
Yeah, I never even noticed that at first and had it.
Oh man, like, wow, I think it's good stuff. It's very good stuff. So.
The Planning Commission podcast is brought to you with support from our friends at planedison.com. In addition to offering the daily planning news that we at the Planning Commission podcast have relied on for years, Plan Edison also offers a whole library of online courses made by and for planners. In fact, the Planning Commission podcast is happy to offer our listeners an exclusive 10% discount on Plan Edison courses subscription. Go to courses.planedison.com/PC10 to get access to over 300 essential planning courses today.
All right, good choice. All right, well, with that, we're going to introduce our guest. And just to set the stage, Megan Kimble is not a planner, and she'll be the first one to tell you that, right? But she is a journalist, she's an author, and she has written extensively, and we'll post her website as well, but we'll let her talk a little bit more about it. But the things that she's written about really caught our eye. Things on food systems planning, something that's a subject we're going to talk more about on this podcast later on. but also affordable housing, zoning, and her latest efforts really get into the sort of the environmental analysis and highway expansion. I mean, holy cow, right? There's some amazing stuff. And we've talked about some of the very subjects that she has been writing about, particularly down in Texas, recently. So with that, author, journalist, Megan Kimble. Megan, thank you for joining the Planning Commission podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Appreciate it. Why don't we just start with you? Tell us a little bit about you, how you got into not only this particular profession, but how you started to stumble into this world of planning without getting into planning, right? How did all that happen? And just bring us up to speed of that journey and where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, the best part about being a journalist is you get to sort of inhabit other people's professions and worlds. And then when you get tired of them, you can move on to a new beat and a new topic. So I mean, I'm constantly learning. That's the best part of my job. But I always wanted to be a writer. I sort of always wanted to be a journalist. So I went to graduate school at the University of Arizona, and I have a master's of fine arts in creative nonfiction. And when I lived in Tucson, I was covering the food system. So I did that through grad school and ended up writing a book. My first book is called Unprocessed, and it's all about our food system and how it is that eaters can kind of participate differently in the industrial food system. And I launched a local food magazine called Edible Baja Arizona. So I edited that magazine for 5 years, and we covered Southern Arizona and Northern Mexico, and covered all aspects of the food system. Not just farming and ranching and agriculture, but also brewing and whiskey making and distilling. And then, we are on the border. And so immigration and water and all the things that happen in the borderlands. So I did that for 5 years, and I covered food for about 7 years. And I kind of started to have an itch to learn about something new. That's sort of my MO as a journalist, is just, I love to learn. And I was living in Tucson at the time, and I had a friend who is the executive director of a fair housing nonprofit. And so, we wrote a lot in my magazine, wrote a lot about how people access good food. How do people access fresh food? We were, food deserts were much more in the news at the time. And he and his organization were doing an analysis of access to opportunity more broadly. And so, just over drinks, week after week, sort of talking to him about his work, I learned a lot about fair housing. And this was the 50-year anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and how it was that American cities were segregated, and how access to opportunity is, in fact, very much dependent on where you live. And where you live is dependent upon a very racist history of segregation and redlining in America. And so I sort of my eyes are open to housing as a way of, so much is dependent on, so much of access to opportunity is dependent on where you live. And that really sort of lit me up in a new way. And so I started writing about housing when I lived in Tucson. I wrote a story about the Fair Housing Act there. And then I moved to Austin. And as I'm sure you and your listeners know, Austin is booming, and the biggest issue that the city faces is affordable housing. So I had already sort of begun to learn about the housing system, the housing market, and affordable housing. And then I got here, and all of those issues were very much supercharged, were kind of front. There's so many stories here about growth, who has access to that growth, who has access to, all the amazing things that are happening in Austin. Well, you have to have money. So once I moved here, I think it was such a dynamic place that there were so many stories about housing, and that's kind of what got me into covering the housing system.
Well, Megan, I'm really curious about your food systems and access journey that you took some time ago. And I want to know, if you were talking to a room full of city planners, what would you talk to them about with food systems? What do you think we should know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of attention was paid when I was writing about food to physical access to food. So are there grocery stores in your community? Are there farmers markets? And I think that's really important. But, I started covering transportation because it's well, if you have a car, you can actually drive to get all the things that you need. If you rely on public transportation, you are much more dependent on the resources that are around you in your neighborhood. So, I think it's zoning is so interesting because it's we've segregated uses. It's not just races. It's it's illegal in most parts of Austin to build markets, to build bars, to build restaurants. So, this is all the stuff that you sort of know, but I think one reason I got into zoning and planning is because it's like all of these things that I was focused on with the food system are not separate from how our cities are structured. So I don't know if I have a good answer of like what I would tell planners.
Yeah. And I don't know that there is a good answer because you're, you're a little set up for that one, right? So it's one of the things that we have that our communities have such trouble with. We've sort of zoned our way out of doing things conveniently, if you will.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you have a car, you can drive anywhere, right? But cost of transportation, cost of personal vehicle transportation, cost of gas, cost of the time to go to. I'm somebody that does not want to go to the grocery store, So it's one of those things that access to food is so important. And my friends laugh at me. I don't, these are my planning nerd friends, but like my regular friends, I'll look for a place to live. I've moved around a lot. And the first thing I look for is where's the closest grocery store? I look for a grocery store and how can I walk to it? And they're like, why would you want to walk to the grocery store? And I'm like, listen, you don't understand the amount of laziness in my life. I do not want to get in a car and go to a grocery store. And they're just like, we don't understand what you mean by lazy. Seems like it would take a lot more work to walk to a grocery store. I'm like, no. I need to be able to get to it no matter what. Like, I'm one of those people that does not remember to put gas in her gas tank. So, this is really important to me. So I think that's interesting that that's the first thing you were saying is that, and I think that planners don't, I think that sometimes when we first start planning, we think, oh, it makes sense. Let's put this, and this in the community. And you just pointed out, you're like, in some places it's illegal to put a market in this particular type of zoning, which you might be talking about single family housing. Why wouldn't we put a market right next to where people live and where their kitchens are? So I think that you're hitting it on the head. You were saying we may already know this. There's planners that don't know that there are places in our communities that you can't do that. And if you tried to do that, you're gonna have to go through a lot of red tape.
Well, and I'll just chime in real quick. And I know Don's got a question, but I was working in a community in North Dakota not too terribly long ago, and here was a particular part of town, perfect in a lot of ways of the street system, gridded. The density was right, good mixture of housing, but there was no neighborhood commercial even allowed by zone. And you started to have this conversation, I think, to Megan's point about, wouldn't it be cool just to have like a little neighborhood ice cream shop? Oh man. Oh man. Parking. The first thing was, well, where are they going to park? And I'm going, if it's like, 400 square feet, are you really that concerned? There's public parking on the streets all over the place, but I think that your perspective is great in that, it's not just about the big box. It's not about the neighborhood store. It's the corner store. And then it's the distribution of the food too, right? And all of that and how it relates to the way that we set up our city. There's a lot of overlap there. So Don?
I just think you've been neck deep in the Austin zoning battles. What's standing out down there? Is there any progress? What's inhibiting it? Just give the listeners a scoop on that.
Yeah, so this somewhat short backstory is that Austin has been trying to update its land development code for nearly a decade now and has spent upwards of $10 million on the effort. It has been extremely contentious, as you might not be surprised. So when I moved here in 2017, Austin was in the process of something called Code Next, and it was the sort of branding rewrite. They brought in an outside firm. The idea was, build more missing middle housing, more affordable housing throughout the city, increase density, so upzone a lot of places, particularly along transit corridors. And that effort faced enormous opposition from existing homeowners. So I would say that the biggest thing that's prevented a new land development code is NIMBY opposition, so not in my backyard opposition. The Code Next was stopped in 2018, I think, and then there was a new effort in 2019 that was sort of rebranded. I think planners I've talked to said that the sort of new code was a much better code that it had. There was, I think, points of opposition in Code Next that the people who were I think genuinely engaged in the process didn't like. So council had to pass it by 3 votes, and they had passed it by 2 votes, and so there was pretty uniform. I'd say it was pretty popular. It was council was on the verge of passing it, and a group of homeowners sued the city, saying that they had not been given proper notice of zoning changes. So in Texas, as in many states, if you change a property owner's zoner, you have to give them notice of like, I forget that it's 250 feet or 200 feet of their, if you change zoning use within that distance of someone's property, you have to give them notice. And the city had argued, well, it's a comprehensive zoning overhaul, it affects every property owner in the city. It would be infeasible to notify every property owner, particularly, if a tenant lives there, then you got to track down the actual person who owns that property. So they argued, that law does not apply with a comprehensive zoning code update. Well, these homeowners sued and said, yes, it does. And that case, so that effectively halted the land development code update. Meanwhile, this is March of 2020, so city leaders had other things on their minds to deal with. And that drug out in court for a year and a half, and then it finally got a hearing in a district court, and the district court judge sided with the homeowners, saying that the city of Austin had violated state law by failing to notify property owners of, again, a citywide zoning update.
How many days did you spend sitting in a courtroom listening to all that?
No, it was on Zoom. So no.
That's true.
The hearing was actually like half an hour long. It was incredibly short for such a consequential. So I looked into the state law, and this idea of property owners being able to protest zoning changes nearby. I mean, I think a lot of people are aware that zoning began in the 1920s with an intent to segregate. Like those are the origins of zoning, to segregate not only races but uses. But as it turns out, protest rights, so the ability, me as a property owner, to protest what happens next door, also has a racist history that very much is wound up in the same effort in the 1920s and 30s of white homeowners trying to control their neighborhoods and the land around them and to protect their property values because of a perceived threat of people of color. Which is to say, zoning is still very much racist and deployed in such a way. So I wrote a story about that for City Lab, but my story didn't change the outcome, which is that we don't have a new zoning code, and I think that ruling really took the wind out of the sails in the sense that, like, I don't know how you do a comprehensive zoning code update without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to notify people, Anyway, I'll stop there. There's more nuance.
Well, no, and I mean, I think that getting back to the zoning stuff too is, I think it tends to get, and you've probably heard the term, just facially neutral language in the code to say, well, no, we don't object to an ADU or we don't object to a duplex. We just want, here's 90 conditions we want on it that essentially has the same effect of excluding it without on the face excluding it. Was that kind of an angle that the NIMBY groups and others were going for, or did they just want to axe the whole thing completely?
A lot of it was around just like, democracy of saying we didn't get an opportunity to weigh in on this, which, other people argued, well, that's why you elect people. They get to make decisions.
We are a representative republic, not a democracy, if we get down to it, right?
But, I think, for the story I wrote, I talked to folks in gentrifying neighborhoods who were resisting the zoning code update. And I think there is a sort of a significant disconnect between what planners are saying, this is good policy, and this will ultimately lower the cost of housing throughout the city. When you increase supply and demand is increasing, ideally, prices go down. But I think, I am certainly sympathetic to people in gentrifying neighborhoods in Austin, where gentrification is like so rapidly transformed neighborhoods that people who have lived there for decades are like, no more change. We don't want any more change. We cannot handle, we want to stay in our homes. Our property taxes are increasing, and we do not want, these big boxy kind of, placeless structures going up around us. And, the counterpoint is, of course, like that has happened under Austin's current zoning code, and that the city is trying to change it to take some pressure off of these gentrifying neighborhoods. But like, they don't see that. And I certainly think that's like, I think that's genuine. And I don't think I certainly try to capture that perspective of people who don't, there's a disconnect between what is good policy writ large and what is happening right now and what I feel threatened by as a homeowner. That said, I would say largely what has happened in Austin are white, wealthy homeowners in West Austin and central neighborhoods have an enormous amount of power given to them by state law that they can protest changes. And that has basically gummed up the whole system so that city leaders have not been able to get anything done.
Yeah. What a time. The story continues all across the country. And by the time this episode airs, I can, I think, speak to this, and that is that, yeah, man, here we are 1,500 miles away and hearing about the stories of Austin. And, again, people kind of going, oh my gosh, look what this code was going to do. Look what it's going to do. And all these just drumming up all these boogeyman type of arguments. And you go, well, wait a minute. It never got adopted. So how do you know
it didn't work? Look at our housing costs.
Right. If any of the stuff that you mentioned was to come true, we have no idea. Right. And yet it's a straw man argument, it's massively frustrating. And I your take on it, that article that you wrote on it was fabulous and just captured it really well. So I want to talk something else about that you have also read or written quite a bit about, and that's this the illegal evictions, background checks, and a lot of the things that I don't know that a lot of planners necessarily think about because it's kind of on a different scale within the housing realm. But I'm curious, what did you learn about in that particular sphere regarding housing that you think maybe more people need to learn about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like there's planning and how we build our cities or rebuild them or retrofit them. And then there's also like state law that governs what rights landlords have and what rights tenants have, and property owners. And Texas is a very landlord-friendly state. And so, there's a lot of just like state laws that make it so it's really hard to be a renter here. You have very few rights. So when the pandemic hit, there were a lot of national news stories about this wave of evictions that were coming. Congress put in protections for renters. And I started hearing about tenants and landlords that were not respecting the law, those protections that Congress had put in place. So I started sort of digging into eviction. So I wrote a couple stories about landlords that were evicting tenants illegally in violation of CARES Act protections. And as I was reporting, and those are sort of like kind of fairly basic stories of like, 200 tenants got kicked out that should not have gotten kicked out. But as I was reporting those stories, I was talking to housing advocates, and they said, the problem with this is that even if that person goes on to find housing, they are blacklisted. They have a eviction on their record. And I was like, wow, what is that? Like, what is the blacklist? Where does it exist? Like, what does that mean that they're blacklisted? Is there a list of tenants somewhere? And that question led to this investigation I did about the tenant screening industry, which is, this massive industry. There's no one company. There are a few really big companies that scrape court records. So if someone files an eviction against me, even if I go to court and fight that eviction and say, one, it's illegal because I'm a victim of domestic violence or some other grounds for that illegal eviction, or I can pay up and I go to court and I say, hey, here's my rent. I'm going to pay up. I'm going to stay housed. There is a record that a landlord filed an eviction against me, and that is a public record. And so what these companies do is they scrape court records across the country, most of which have been digitized, and they bundle them up and then they sell them to corporate landlords who then buy those. And when I go to apply for an apartment, they look my name and they say, oh, hey, either she has been evicted or an eviction has been filed against her, and I can use that as a basis to deny renting an apartment to her. And so I talked to numerous people who became homeless as a result of that. I talked to several women who were evicted because they were victims of domestic violence, which is illegal. And they became homeless because they could not find an apartment, a complex to rent to them. And so there's a whole, I think there's like the kind of lesson maybe in terms of planning is like, there's an enormous profitable industry around keeping people vulnerably housed. And I learned a lot about that in this story that I wrote. And that is not a thing you can fix by planning. It's the thing you have to fix with laws.
And it's like we always hear, hey, we have a fair housing or we do this. And as the moment you start to peel away that onion, right, it's just not there. It's just simply not true. Is that a fair, succinct way to say that?
Yeah, I mean, there are actually lawyers that have tried to bring fair housing cases I mean, there are not very many housing laws. I think this like essential thing is that you have the Fair Housing Act, which is like, you know, and then like there are acts that protect specific demographics like victims of domestic violence, but the Fair Housing Act does not extend. Like there have been lawyers that have tried to bring cases about illegal evictions, but you have to prove the race of people being evicted. That data is not included in eviction records. So it's like a really high burden to prove in court that eviction disproportionately impacts people who are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So there have been attempts, you know, states have had attempts to like seal eviction records, for example. There are ways that you can fix this problem. It's just, I don't know that I think there was this moment of like, during the pandemic of urgency around preventing eviction and protecting people from eviction. But I don't know if that moment has passed. I'm certainly not an expert on eviction, but it was really striking to me how one eviction, you know, someone falls behind on the rent once, they get laid off, they have a medical emergency, can impact you for almost for the rest of your life and make it very hard for you to find housing. I think a lot of people would say that's unjust.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit into what you have been writing a lot about right now, and that's the highways. So highways, their expansion, the environmental process that's wrapped around highways, and especially when they're served up with federal funds and state funds. So what got into you that you wanted to start writing about highways? How did you even start going down that path? I have a little sister who knows what I do for a living, and she just, if I start talking about an intersection or something, she just looks right at me and she goes, "Jessica, you're talking about roads?" And it's super boring. So you clearly didn't have that on your side. What interests you there?
Yeah, so it's actually connected to zoning. So I wrote a story. I used to work at the Texas Observer. And so I wrote a story in late 2019 about Austin's effort to update its zoning code. And this was like when it seemed like it was going to pass. They did a whole story about this decade-long effort to update the zoning code. And how, as Austin has boomed, that growth has been largely sprawl oriented. And so you can see maps of like the development that has, you know, encircled Austin because people are still moving here. They just cannot afford to live in the city. I mean, there just simply isn't enough housing that's been built within city limits. And so I wrote the story for the Observer. And then like 2 months later, the Texas Department of Transportation announced that they intended to spend $5 billion to expand Interstate 35 right through the middle of Austin. And, you know, the kind of urbanist crowd was sort of like outraged. A lot of people, I think, saw TxDOT's renderings and were somewhat horrified, myself included as an Austinite. But I felt like no one had really made the connection between this failed. And at that point, by March, it was clear that the Land Development Code rewrite had failed because of this homeowner opposition. And I felt like no one had really made the connection between these are the same story. Like Austin is sprawling. Yeah. We as a city have failed to allow enough people to live here and build densely enough. And so what TxDOT is doing is fairly rational. Like people have moved to these suburbs, Kyle, Round Rock, strung along the interstate corridor, and they have to get back to work. They have to get back to school. They have to get back to all the resources that exist in Austin. And so they are widening the highway to facilitate that movement. And I felt like that was a story, that there was something there that was bigger than the resistance to widening a highway. I think I was much more interested in like, well, why are we doing this to begin with? And once I started reporting on the expansion in Austin, I found out about an expansion in Houston, which was much farther along and much bigger. This $9 billion project to expand 28 miles of highway, including the entire inner loop around Houston, that would displace more than 1,200 families. Mostly families of color. And so I started reporting on that. And it was sort of like, once I had kind of these two cities in mind, it was like there were reporters in both cities doing really great coverage of what's happening in Austin, what's happening in Houston. And I was like, yeah, but what's happening with TxDOT? Like the agency is up here.
Yeah.
Why are they doing this? Like what is driving their decision-making? No one had really looked that much at the state agency, and not just TxDOT, but the Texas Transportation Commission, which governs TxDOT. And the Texas Transportation Commission is appointed by our governor, Governor Greg Abbott. So like, what is the incentive here? Like why, I mean, that as a journalist, I'm always just like, why are we doing these things? You know, like what is the what's the reason behind it? What's the engine that's kind of propelling these projects forward, particularly when 60 years of evidence shows that adding capacity to a highway doesn't fix traffic. So
Bingo.
why
Well,
are we still expanding highways?
And it
And
seems
that
ironic.
question,
I would say it seems ironic on when we were just finished talking about uber local neighborhood control over a decision. And on the other end of this, you've got a decision that's almost made without any real public scrutiny or public ability to protest it in the same way. I mean, that just blows my mind. And I think everything's bigger in Texas, so it ends up
It's
being
also
accentuated.
expected, right? We live in a car-centric world. We grew up the greatest thing, and I know this is changing now, but I grew up and your ticket to freedom was getting your driver's license, getting a car, and so it's almost, we don't question what a freeway expansion. Oh, they're the DOT's widening a highway. It's like, well, hopefully they know what they're doing over there. And I think that what the question that you're asking, which I think is a really important question, as we are all these other domino effects are happening, like you're saying, like we're having housing problems. We can't, folks can't live where they work because there's not enough housing, and it makes it expensive because supply and demand and all these kind of things. And so, all right, let's widen the way people get around, and we're spending all of this money to widen these roads, and then they're displacing other housing units, and it's like this is vicious circle. So that the question that you're asking is, why are we doing it? What is really the thought process behind doing that? And do you have an answer? The thought behind widening highways? Because I'm curious.
yeah, I think what I have landed on is that there is this belief that seamless car travel equates economic prosperity. I don't think that's necessarily always supported by evidence, but I think there's a pretty strong belief, particularly in the Republican Party, that the freedom of car travel, the autonomy of car travel, those are American values, and that if we make it harder for people to travel by car, our economy will suffer. And Greg Abbott has said as much, that everything we're doing to expand highways in Texas cities is supporting Texas's, business growth, and our position is like one of the fastest growing economies in the US. So that's the belief that I think people who are fighting highways are up against.
And then we see declining driver's licenses in younger, over time. I read something the other day. I think it was something like only 46% of 17-year-olds now have a driver's license, whereas something, I am probably getting these all messed up, but 20 years ago, it was something like 90% of them had driver's license. So it's changing from the time I was a teenager and to today. The teenagers today, it's not that quote ticket to freedom anymore. And there are other ways of getting around. And it's funny because it's not our transit system, right? It's the Uber, it's this cost share or the ride share and things. So anyway, and I feel like I need to get off that topic because now I'm wandering into something that our listeners are going to be like, we're going to have to do a little corrections corner there and let Jess get her percentages right. But it's just really interesting to me that we're continuing to hold on to this, like you said, a belief, this value that you got to have a car, and that's what drives our economy. But we're seeing our teenagers are not getting their driver's licenses. So what's really the truth?
Part of that is somewhat of a vicious cycle, as we have not funded transit in this country. And so therefore it is very inconvenient to ride transit in most American cities. It doesn't get you where you're going in any kind of efficient fashion. So therefore to access economic opportunity, you need a car. And I don't actually really believe that's changing despite the stats about young people. I think it's very hard once you need a job and once you have to pay your own rent. It's really hard to live in most cities without a car.
Well, and if you're having to drive till you qualify or drive till you can afford a place to rent for stuff, that only exacerbates the problem on that. So Chris led this off with a question of just environmental laws, good and bad. Now we think about between your work on food, your work on housing, your work on transportation. What would be your answer to that? What good, what maybe harm have some of our environmental laws made or done in these realms.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer in terms of like environmental laws. I think I have thought a lot about public input in my work. I've covered Austin's housing woes, which have been stymied by public input and public opposition. I've also written about these highway expansions where communities of color who are most impacted are not given a say. They do not get to say, hey, we don't want this highway in our backyard. This is actually not how we want to get around. We want safer transit access. We want safer walking options. And like, who gets a say? Like, I think having covered the zoning battle in Austin, I'm like, neighborhoods should get less say. And then having covered these highway expansions, I'm like, neighborhoods should get more say.
And
Come
together
NEPA,
in the middle somewhere.
NEPA does not. NEPA was not really set up to create that distinction. I think I wrote a long story about this, the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. for the New York Times. And that what was so compelling to me about that story is that the planners of that bridge have spent years and years and years engaging the community around it and getting their input. And it's a predominantly low-income Black community, and allowing them to shape the future of that piece of infrastructure, this bridge park that will span the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. And I think that is an extremely compelling model. And yet I also live in Austin, where that kind of extensive public input has really stymied what I think are important positive changes for the city. And so, and you can't, public input cannot be, currently we don't have like an affirmative action for public input. There's no way to say underserved communities of color get more say. But so I don't know what the mechanism is for that, but I think, NEPA is used, currently NEPA is the best option to stop a bad highway project. Through public input and public engagement. And yet that same law can be weaponized against transit and other forms of, more sustainable infrastructure. So I don't have a good answer, except it's complicated.
Well, and I see, like, especially when the zoning side of things, the people that are giving the most input and therefore given probably the most opportunity to give input are the ones on that upper end of the income scale that have the time, have the resources, the ability to do it. If you're working a service sector job or having to commute long distances or whatever, that's not exactly the thing you have going on in life that you're going to be able to devote a ton of time to. Do you think that was a part of that effort? I mean, I think it's pretty common, but was it exclusively there in Austin? Was that an issue they were dealing with on the zoning code?
Yeah, I mean, affluence shows up to public meetings. Like, I think so I don't know that more public meetings is the answer. It's like, this bridge park in DC, that took a lot of money and effort to engage people who are not otherwise engaged, who do not either feel empowered to speak up at a public meeting or simply cannot show up. Like, that requires a very different, more creative form of input seeking. And it's like, we don't currently we don't have funding for that. There is just like often public input is this like box checking exercise. And our laws give property owners more power. Like, that's just and property owners, because of racist planning in the past, are predominantly white people. So like, I think one way to level the playing field is to not allow property owners to have so much say in what happens in cities.
Well, you mentioned the affluent come to public meetings, and oftentimes I think it's the public meetings that come to the affluent.
Right.
And where are they holding these things? I've heard for years this idea, that we should have public meetings in these different locations with childcare and food, and yeah, great. And like, to your point, well, that requires budget. And like, well, no, we're not going to approve that much budget for the public outreach. And you go, well, then we're going to, probably end up with this type of feedback that we think. And a fan of this show, and somebody we have had on, maybe Andy Baynow, he has a great, I think, perspective where he shows public opinion versus public interest. And it doesn't always correlate, right? And because we know sometimes that the public interest of things and the public benefit is not always going to align. And to your point with some of these things, it's hard, not only getting the right opinions, but obviously then demonstrating that what you're thinking about, what you're trained to do will work if we give it an opportunity. I want to ask you a quick question before we turn the lightning round, but you're in Austin now, capital city, right? And I wonder how much of the zoning code rewrite, how much of this highway, is there any of it's coming from Austin. And because it's coming from Austin, therefore capital city. I know that happens in my state. If something comes from the city of Boise, oh man, the state legislature, from folks all around the state get all worked up. But I'm curious if there's any of that goes on in Texas and what Austin has tried to do.
You mean with the highway fight specifically?
The highway fight and also the zoning rewrite and any other initiatives that maybe they've tried to enact.
Yeah, I mean, like most cities, but I think it's particularly true in Texas. The state legislature kind of, Austin is this quote unquote liberal city, the blueberry and the tomato soup, and the state government does not has, like Austin will pass, for example, protections for workers, and the state will preempt those and say, actually, it's illegal to pass this kind of protection for a worker. So that's happened for years and years. I think that dynamic is pretty well entrenched. The distinct thing about highways is that they're actually state facilities. So I-35 through Austin is owned by the state. And despite Austin City Council, actually, even the mayor of Austin really has no authority over that place. And we've seen in Houston, TxDOT had this massive highway expansion there. The city was, the mayor, city council came out against that highway. Harris County sued TxDOT because they were so dissatisfied with what the state agency is planning. And they got some concessions. It's a long story that I could go into, but largely TxDOT can do what they want. And so cities don't really have very much authority over state projects. And that's not just true in Texas. That's true in most states. With most state
that's why
DOTs.
I worry about what we talk about with the infrastructure bill. If the feds aren't going to make a TxDOT build a sidewalk on an urban project, well, nobody else has the authority. So your talk about safety and equity only goes as far as what you're willing to force these agencies to do, because they really don't have to answer to the public or anybody else.
Yeah, correct.
Well, Megan, we're gonna transition into our lightning round. We appreciate, certainly your take on a lot of these things, and I would encourage all of our listeners and our guests to go to megankimble.com and check out these articles. There's a bunch of them on there, a lot of good things. I know I was bouncing around from the bridge story. Oh man, that's an incredible one. But also, the things that we've talked about with the zoning ordinance in Austin and the highway expansion and on and on. You've been writing for a good number of years now. And your resume and all of the titles that you have to show for it, most of which are there or accessible. So turn into our lightning round, Jess. Go ahead. I want to have you hit one off.
This one's very important, so think carefully. Deep Eddies or Tito's? You can't decide.
I don't drink vodka.
Perfect. So for those of you that don't know, Deep Eddies and Tito's is from Austin, Texas, and I'm a Deep Eddy kind of gal. So anyway.
I should have done that as the pairing today.
I don't know what you were thinking, Long Branch. Are
you a hook 'em horns up or a hook 'em horns down kind of person?
Who hooks them down? I don't know that.
Anybody who doesn't like the Longhorns. So
gotcha. Got it.
There's another football thing for you, Jess.
What's your go-to journalism type movie? What's your favorite movie of all time that is in that realm?
Spotlight is great.
Of course.
I feel like that captures some of the reality and the drudge work of journalism.
So Austin, you wrote about.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, say Austin is a food city through and through. I got to ask, what's your go-to place and what are you ordering?
Oh yeah. Tacos are the city's, I think, high point. I'm reluctant to share my favorite taco place, but I will. There's this food truck called Discada. It's on the east side. And they use this, it's called Discada because they make their meat in like a plow disc. It's a form of cooking from a specific region of Mexico. And it's slow cooked beef and pork. It's simmered for 12 hours or something. And they sell one kind of taco. That's it.
That's it.
Wow.
That's all you need.
Something, do it well.
Like that, right? Yeah.
That's
Why
amazing.
mess around? Holy
Okay.
cow.
Wow. So if you're not a vodka drinker And what is a beverage that you enjoy? And it doesn't have to be alcohol. We drink all kinds of things.
I am a beer drinker, so there are lots of great
Okay.
local breweries in Texas and Austin. There's one here called, Thirsty Goat is my favorite beer. It's made by an Austin brewery.
Oh my
I like
gosh,
that
that sounds
title.
awesome.
So you wrote
Thirsty
a lot
Goat.
about, you spent a year of eating only whole unprocessed foods. How did that Big Mac taste when you got done with that year?
Actually, this is, I'm going to spoil the end of the book, but my first processed meal, I was living in Tucson, Arizona, was a Sonoran hot dog, which if you haven't heard of is a hot dog wrapped in bacon.
Yes, absolutely. I love hot dogs. That's probably where I would have gone directly after an unprocessed diet, gone directly for a hot dog in a fluffy, I wouldn't have wrapped in bacon. I want fluffy bun. And I'm a weirdo.
No, and then it's in a
mayonnaise
bun.
some hot dog. Okay, good.
Oh,
and then I would put mayonnaise on it, and everyone's going to be upset at me. I don't look at this. Like, look, mayonnaise and ketchup on a hot dog is the only way to eat it, but I've been told otherwise. Okay,
you're an Arizona, also former resident. Grand Canyon, underrated or overrated?
I lived in Southern Arizona, which is like 6 hours from the Grand Canyon. So I would say the border is the reason to visit is underrated. The border towns are really beautiful along there.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. So you have a degree in creative nonfiction writing. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you read for a good time?
The last year I have been reading a lot about transportation, which I would not say is the best time.
It's a little dry sometimes.
Yeah, I do love, current nonfiction. I read Patrick Radden Keefe is one of my favorite authors. Okay. I read a lot of novels. I just read this novel called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. It's about two gamers and their friendship. So I really read all over the place. I did read The Power Broker last year, which I'm like proud to check that one off.
That's awesome.
That's why I was had in here, the Superhighway Super Hoax by Helen Levitt from 1970. And it's like, it's pointing out stuff 50 years ago that today we're still trying to figure out how to overcome.
I wonder if anybody at Texas A&M's College of Highway Engineering, if they've ever been so bold as to make that mandatory reading. Think so? Probably not.
Well, I hope to make a visit there with my book, so we'll see how that goes.
Actually, this would probably get banned in Texas libraries. So.
Oh, come on.
There you go. All right. Well, Megan Kimble, we appreciate your time. We thank you for spending it with us. I know you got things you got to get after at the top of the hour here, so we appreciate it. Again, go to her website, www.megankimble.com. Exciting things on the way. I know exciting stories and books that I know you can't exactly get into, but it's on the way, I promise. And as I mentioned, all of the wonderful articles that she's written, and there are some good ones. Go to that website and check it out. Megan, thank you for joining the Planning Commission podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. If I could just plug real quick, I do have a book coming out in March 2024. It's called City Limits. So please stay tuned. It's about highways.
Yeah, and I gotta say, as a former journalist and mostly planner, I've always had a great appreciation for those that do dive into these issues and get at the complexities, because it's not always the easiest thing to understand. And I know there's a lot of fields like that, but I know I can definitely tell a difference when I'm reading a story of somebody who's probably been given the time to dive into it more so than being willing to, because there's so many other things on that. So I appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right, to our listeners, hit up the website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. We appreciate your time, and lots more to come from us. So thank you. Commissioners, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. Second. See y'all next time. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, past episodes, video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.